Today, you are most associated with ancient prehistory and ancient civilizations. But you started out as a journalist covering current affairs, and even in this capacity, you have a fascinating body of work behind you, including books like Ethiopia, The Challenge of Hunger, AIDS, The Deadly Epidemic. Before going a little bit more counter-approved narrative with books like The Lords of Poverty, The Power, the Prestige, and Corruption of the International Aid Business.
Yeah.
What took you from investigating contemporary current affairs to ancient history?
Well, it was a process for me. The background to this is always from my childhood. I was writing poetry, songs. This was the way in which I naturally expressed myself. And the question was, how would I manifest that into a way to make a living? And journalism seemed the obvious solution, but at the same time, I wanted to travel and to explore the world. So in 1974, I applied for a scholarship to the Leverhulme Foundation to go to Somalia in the Horn of Africa and to spend a year there. And the reason for this was that Somalia had only in 1972 written its language. Before that, it was an oral language only with no written script. So the overt purpose of my project was to look at the implications for journalism and the media in Somalia of this introduction of a script for the Somali language. And indeed, I did write a couple of papers about that. But for me, the main purpose was to immerse myself completely and deeply in Somali culture. And this was the time when I became enthusiastic about Africa in general and about the problems of developing countries. The year in Somalia was 1975 to 1976. The application went in 74, but I lived in Somalia from 1975 to 1976. And when I came back, I, like every young 20-year-old, I was 26 at that time. I was looking for a job, and I was offered a job on a radical campaigning magazine called New Internationalist. And I was offered the job of co-editor on New Internationalist magazine. I'd already written quite a number of freelance articles from Somalia and had established a bit of a track record. And this was my first proper job. And I was co-editor of New Internationalist magazine, and we were exploring development issues and exploring the challenges faced by developing countries and the heavy and oppressive role of the so-called developed countries upon the developing countries. And it was during my time at New Internationalist that I became interested in the subject of foreign aid. But I think I've always been a bit of a contrarian. And I didn't have the kind of warm and accepting attitude to foreign aid that one was supposed to have in the 1970s and 1980s. I had seen too many cases where there were real problems caused by foreign aid, where foreign aid wasn't creating independence, but was rather creating dependence. And this was a line that I followed through the 1980s and eventually led to the publication in 1989 of a book called Lords of Poverty, the book that you mentioned, which was a stringent critique of the aid business. But I had got myself into a position where I could write that book because I had written a number of previous books. Now, you mentioned my book on Ethiopia, The Challenge of Hunger, which was about the famine in Ethiopia in 1984. But before that, I had written one other book, and that was a travel book called Journey Through Pakistan, which was photographed by the late, great Muhammad Amin and my friend Duncan Willits, and it allowed me to travel for 6 months extensively around Pakistan and, get introduced to that culture as well. So I would say that my my work background was a mixture of constant writing, investigation, and exploration, coupled with a great deal of travel. In 1982, I went back to live in Africa and lived in Kenya, where I was the East Africa correspondent for The Economist. Of course, The Economist is a very well-established mainstream magazine, and it sounds very grand to be the East Africa correspondent of The Economist. But in fact, I was a stringer. I was paid 50 UK pounds a month, and anything I earned over that depended on the number of words that I wrote for The Economist during that particular month. So it wasn't making me a big living, but it opened a lot of doors for me, and it allowed me to travel very widely around East Africa and to interview key figures in that in that region. It was while I was working as East Africa correspondent for The Economist that I first went to Ethiopia, a country that became very central and very important in my life. I started traveling to Ethiopia from 1982 onwards. Again, enormous travels and explorations in Ethiopia. This was where I came across my first historical mystery, which was that Ethiopia claims to possess the lost Ark of the Covenant, as in Raiders of the Lost Ark, as in the Indiana Jones movie. Well, when I heard this, when I came across this tradition, I was actually in the city of Aksum in Tigray province in northern Ethiopia, where the Ark is supposedly kept. And I met the monk who was supposedly the guardian of the Ark of the Covenant. And although the story seemed outrageous and extreme and impossible, I was very impressed by his solidity and his certainty that it was indeed the Ark of the Covenant that he was the custodian of. So I began to research this subject. While doing many other things in the background, I began to research the Ethiopian claim to possess the lost Ark of the Covenant. And I found that mainstream archaeology and history was totally opposed to this notion. They believed that Ethiopia had simply made the whole story up, that there was no reality to it whatsoever. But my investigations on the ground suggested something very different. For example, I found myself amongst the community of indigenous Ethiopian Jews who are known in Ethiopia as the Falashas. They call themselves the Beta Israel. And they were practicing a very Old Testament form of Judaism. As a matter of fact, they did not have rabbis. They had priests, which were abandoned in Talmudic Judaism. They performed sacrifices of rams. And again, this was forbidden in Talmudic Judaism. It seemed to be a very ancient form of Judaism that was being practiced in Ethiopia. And I spent many weeks amongst the Falashas interviewing their elders and getting their story. And their story was that their ancestors had come to Ethiopia and had brought the Ark of the Covenant with them. But before doing so, they had spent several hundred years in Egypt, and that they had been based upon an island in southern Egypt. So this was a clue that I could check, I could investigate. I began talking to biblical scholars, such as Menahem Haran at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and they confirmed for me that there had indeed been a Jewish community in southern Egypt on the island of Elephantina, roughly from 650 BC until about 450 BC. And then that community had mysteriously vanished, and their temple had been destroyed. There had been a dispute with the ancient Egyptians, and this community was forced to move out. And the story that the Ethiopian Jews told was that their ancestors had followed the Nile River system south. They had taken the Blue Nile branch, and they had ended up around Lake Tana in Ethiopia, where the Blue Nile rises. This is exactly where the Falashas were still living in the 1970s and the 1980s. Eventually, as I think everybody knows, the majority of the Ethiopian Jews were airlifted to Israel during the fall of the dictatorship of Ethiopia in 1991. But at the time that I was researching, they were very much present in Ethiopia. And it was their story, more than anything else, which caused me to take Ethiopia's claim to possess the Ark of the Covenant seriously. And this was also my first encounter with with mainstream archaeology and with the rigid positions that archaeologists take and their unwillingness to consider alternative possibilities. And I see my role as offering reasonably argued, well-evidenced alternative possibilities for people to consider. And that's precisely what I did in the case of Ethiopia. And it led to the publication in 1992 of my first book of historical mystery, which was called The Sign and the Seal, A Quest for the Lost Ark of the Covenant. And this was the turning point for me when I moved out of reporting current affairs and moved into investigating issues of prehistory, and particularly of remote prehistory. There are aspects of the Ark of the Covenant that sounded technological. They sounded out of place in time. They didn't seem to belong to that period. In addition to that, in order to research the book, as well as traveling widely in Ethiopia, as well as traveling widely in Israel, I also had to travel widely in Egypt, because you cannot separate the story of the Ark of the Covenant from the story of Moses. And Moses, as we know, was reared in the household of the Pharaoh in Egypt, according to the Bible, and indeed was groomed as a potential future Pharaoh. It was while I was investigating this that I found myself in front of the Great Pyramid of Egypt for the first time. An astonishing mystery, just a staggering impact upon the eye and upon the senses. And I, of course, looked into it. And what do archaeologists say this thing is? And they said it's the tomb of a pharaoh. But as I began to look further, I could find no compelling evidence that it was the tomb of any particular pharaoh. And this was the first clue, really, amongst others, that led me to the next investigation, which was Fingerprints of the Gods, published in 1995, which is really when I began my quest for a lost civilization of prehistory.